For those of you who do not know me, I am Eddie Weeks, your legislative librarian. Your legislative library is just across the hall here in Suite 804. Please stop by and say hi at any time. I am there to answer just about any historical question you may have about the legislature, old laws, past legislators, the legislative process, and even what is the history of the women's suffrage movement in Tennessee? What a great question. Let's start our answer in 1776. Yep, 1776, for just a little background information. That year, John Adams wrote in a letter to James Sullivan, "It is dangerous to open so fruitful a source of controversy and altercation as would be opened by attempting to alter the qualifications of voters. There will be no end of it. New claims will arise. Women will demand a vote. Lads from 12 to 21 will think their rights not enough attended to, and every man who has not a farthing will demand an equal voice with all others in acts of state." That was May 26, 1776. 20 years later, Tennessee joined the Union as its 16th state. Its constitution was somewhat revolutionary and was supposedly described by Thomas Jefferson, something of an expert on constitutions, as the least imperfect of all the state constitutions. That constitution, in Article 3, Section 1, declared every freeman of the age of 21 years and upwards, possessing a freehold in the county wherein he may vote, and every freeman being an inhabitant of any one county in the state 6 months immediately preceding the date of the election, shall be entitled to vote. You didn't have to own land to vote. That was incredible. You did, however, have to be a man. And to be a member of the legislature, you not only had to own land, you had to own at least 200 acres of land in the county you represented and be a man. You see, the federal Constitution had no voting rights or requirements. It was strictly a state issue, and the different states had different laws. New Jersey, for example, permitted women the right to vote if the woman owned land in her own name. And women then lost that right in New Jersey with the enactment of the new state constitution there in 1807. Tennessee also needed a new constitution, which came about in 1835. And that constitution cleared up any confusion with its statement that every free white man shall be entitled to vote. Slaves, of course, could not vote, and neither could women. From 1861 to 1865, the Civil War ravaged and raged in Tennessee and in that state capital. In the aftermath of that war, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution were ratified in that building, which would be a great topic for a future Lunch and Learn. But now, all were equal, with voting rights for all, as expressed in the new Tennessee Constitution of 1870. Every male person of the age of 21 years shall be entitled to vote. So the only requirement now was being a man, a fact that the Tennessee Supreme Court explained in State Ex Rel v. Davidson. Although a woman may be a citizen, she is not entitled, by virtue of her citizenship, to take any part in the government, either as a voter or an officer. Despite this decision, though, women's suffrage continued to be an issue in Tennessee. In fact, it became more of an issue as more states joined the Union. You see, many of these new Western states had already granted women the right to vote in the hopes of attracting more women to live there. The Wyoming Territory, for example, granted women the right to vote in 1869. This caused something of a stir in 1890 when Wyoming wanted to be the 44th state of the Union. the Wyoming Territorial Legislature replied to the controversy, "We may stay out of the Union for 100 years, but we will come in with our women." And what was happening out west was also being noticed in Tennessee. Women in Tennessee were now demanding their own political freedom. This cartoon is from the Nashville Tennessean magazine in 1915. Several of the images in this presentation are courtesy of the State Librarian Archives' TIVA unit on suffrage. TIVA is the Tennessee Virtual Archive. For more information on this topic, please go to the State Librarian Archives website, find TIVA, find the unit on suffrage, and have fun. By 1915, the issue of women's suffrage in Tennessee could no longer be ignored. That year, in his State of the State address to the legislature, Governor Ben Hooper declared, "As an original academic proposition, I have never been an advocate of women's suffrage. I still feel that if things in the world were as I believe they ought to be, woman's suffrage would not be desirable. The consideration that weighs most heavily on me, however, is that women's suffrage is rapidly coming to the other states of the Union, and there is not the shadow of a doubt that women will ultimately vote in all elections in every state in the nation. Knowing this to be true, why should Tennessee delay the agitation of this question? I therefore recommend an amendment to the state constitution granting the franchise to women." That amendment, though, might not be necessary because in 1915, the U.S. Congress took up a federal constitutional amendment on women's suffrage, which failed in the U.S. House of Representatives by a vote of 20 ayes to 174 noes. The Johnson City Comet on January 14, 1915 reported, "Anti-suffragists were well satisfied. The result was what we expected," said Mrs. Arthur M. Dodge, president of the National Association Opposed to Woman Suffrage. "It means that the suffrage movement, fostered by hysterical women, is on the wane." The Tennessee legislature, though, proceeded with a recommendation of Governor Hooper, proposing amendments to the Tennessee Constitution in March and May of 1915, granting women the right to vote in all elections. And all those resolutions had to do was pass the next General Assembly by a 2/3 vote of each house. In 1917, Governor Thomas Rye also took up the cause of women's suffrage. In his State of the State message, he explained, "Under our present Constitution, the right of equal suffrage cannot be extended to women without such constitutional amendment. I cannot at this time refrain from saying that I can see no reason why our women are not entitled to the privileges they ask at the hands of their representatives." The 60th General Assembly of the state of Tennessee did not take up either of the resolutions sent to them by the 59th General Assembly. The Tennessee Constitution remained unchanged, and women continued to not have the right to vote. But world events were taking center stage and entering a turning point. World War I ended in November 1918. The 61st General Assembly of Tennessee convened in January 1919 in a new world. And that General Assembly took definite steps toward women's suffrage with 1919 House Bill 717 to grant suffrage to women in certain elections. On April 17, 1919, Governor A.H. Roberts signed House Bill 717 into law, giving women the right to vote in presidential and municipal elections. The problem was the Tennessee Constitution still only mentioned male persons as voters. But the key is what it says right after that. Shall be entitled to vote for members of the General Assembly and other civil officers for the county or district in which he resides. It makes no mention of presidential or municipal elections. So, that public chapter was not in violation of the Tennessee Constitution, as it permitted women to vote in other elections. But, as the Tennessee Supreme Court explained in Vertrees v. State Board of Elections, the governor and the members of the General Assembly must still be elected by qualified voters, which only means male persons. The court went on to say, it is obvious that the votes of women and the votes of men will have to be kept separate in the general elections in order to ensure a fair election. That is, a fair election is one in which only men vote for the governor and members of the General Assembly. In May 1919, a new Congress took office. The month after the 61st General Assembly of Tennessee adjourned sine die on April 17th. On June the 4th, 1919, Congress submitted to the 48 states of the Union a proposed constitutional amendment, the proposed 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote in all elections. The timing is crucial. There's a presidential election coming in November 1920. This proposed amendment must be ratified by 3/4 of the 48 states before November 1920, or women may not vote for president for 4 more years. How urgent was it? 9 states ratified the proposed amendment before the end of that month. Tennessee, of course, could not ratify it at that time, as the General Assembly had already adjourned and would not meet again until January 1921. The only way that they could ratify it before then would be through an extraordinary session called by the governor. Other states, though, continued to debate and ratify the amendment. By the end of 1919, 22 states had ratified the proposed amendment, and 2 states had rejected the amendment. A new year begins, and another 13 ratifications by the end of March 1920. That made 35 ratifications, and another 4 states had rejected the amendment. 2 states were still in session, Delaware and Louisiana, both of which rejected the amendment. It was now the end of July 1920. The presidential election was less than 4 months away. 35 ratifications, 8 rejections, and 5 states left that had yet to consider the proposed amendment. But Tennessee could not even consider the proposed amendment because of the state constitution. You see, Article 2, Section 32 of the Tennessee Constitution says, "No convention or General Assembly of this state shall act upon any amendment to the Constitution of the United States unless such convention or General Assembly shall have been elected after such amendment is submitted." The amendment was submitted by Congress in June 1919. The 61st General Assembly was elected in November 1918. The next election for the General Assembly wouldn't be until November 1920. The amendment could not be voted on until after then. But as we all know, what the law says and what the law means are often different things. You see, the U.S. Constitution makes no provision for states to wait until after an election to ratify or reject a proposed amendment. And Tennessee Attorney General Frank M. Thompson declared the act of ratification of a federal amendment by the state derives its authority from the federal Constitution. Therefore, the legislature of Tennessee would not be controlled by said Section 32 of Article 2 of the Tennessee Constitution if it should meet in extraordinary session and either ratify or decline to ratify said 19th Amendment. So, the Tennessee legislature could ratify the amendment if a special session was called by the governor. 35 of the 48 states had ratified, one short of the 3/4 needed for the ratification of the proposed amendment. The nation was waiting on the perfect 36th state. But there was no need for it to be Tennessee. Women here, after all, already had the right to vote for president and the right to vote in municipal elections. Surely one of those other 4 states who had yet to consider the proposed amendment would step up and be that perfect 36th state. In fact, on July 12, 1920, the Memphis News-Scimitar reported that it would not be Vermont. The next day came the news that it would not be Florida. All eyes now turned to Tennessee. Would Governor Roberts be willing to issue the call? He was, after he had secured his own renomination for the governor. The Chattanooga News: there would be no special session until after the August primary, when the governor has finished his race for the Democratic nomination and when the danger of the woman vote in the primary is past. The Chattanooga News, August 6, 1920, announced that Governor Roberts had been renominated. His reelection will depend largely on whether or not the legislature, in extraordinary session, carries out the demands of the state platform in the matters of tax reform, the repeal of the Utilities Bill, and the ratification of the 19th Amendment. On August 7, 1920, Governor Roberts issued his proclamation. The members were to meet in extraordinary session at noon, August 9, 1920, to take action upon the amendment of the Constitution of the United States, giving women full right of suffrage, being the proposed 19th Amendment to the federal Constitution. This was not, though, the only topic in that call of the extraordinary session. In fact, Governor Roberts listed 142 separate items for the legislature to consider before declaring that only matters of compelling urgency have been included in this call. And on the next day, he added another 20 items for legislative consideration. Governor Roberts' message to the extraordinary session declared, "The legislatures of 35 states have ratified this amendment, only one more state being required to make it effective as a part of the Constitution of the United States. The prompt ratification of this proposed amendment is earnestly and urgently recommended." Tennessee occupies a pivotal position upon this question. The eyes of all America are upon us. Millions of women are looking to the Tennessee legislature to give them a voice and share in shaping the destiny of the republic. We tend to think of any political issue today as a Republican-Democratic split. If one party is in favor, the other party must be opposed. But this issue was not a Republican-Democratic split, as explained by the governor. The National Democratic Platform declared, "We endorse the proposed 19th Amendment granting equal suffrage." The National Republican Platform declared, "We welcome women into full participation in the affairs of government." So who was opposed? There were actually both national and state associations organized solely to oppose the ratification. And their main weapon was propaganda. Can anybody terrorize Tennessee manhood? Their push wasn't to stop the proposed amendment, but to save the South from the amendment. And their language was very, very clear. The more a politician allows himself to be henpecked, the more henpecking we will have in politics. A vote for federal suffrage is a vote for organized female nagging forever. Neither, though, was it a male-female split. Many of the leading anti-suffragists were women. This photo of the outer office of the anti-ratification headquarters in the Hotel Hermitage makes this plain. Many prominent women were opposed to granting other women the right to vote. Graham McGregor Smith, teacher, writer, editor, organizer, declared, "I am decidedly opposed to it. The very wheels of time would have to stop while the woman voter talked." Despite these misgivings, the wheels of time rolled on. The Senate was now prepared to act on Senate Joint Resolution 1, ratifying a proposed amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The members of the legislature did not wear their opinions on their sleeves, but on their lapels. You could tell how a man planned to vote by the rose that he wore. Red roses for those opposed, and yellow roses for those in favor of ratification. On Friday, August 13th, 1920, the Senate took up the minority report. That this body refused to act upon Senate Joint Resolution 1, we being of the opinion that the present legislature has no right or authority to act their own at all, and the same should be deferred to the succeeding legislature. The report was tabled by the vote of 23 to 10. Next came the majority report. The Committee on Constitutional Amendments has carefully considered Senate Joint Resolution 1 and is of the opinion that this present legislature has both a legal and moral right to ratify the proposed amendment. The majority report is adopted. The Senate then proceeded to vote on Senate Joint Resolution 1. There were no electronic voting machines and no microphones. The clerk shouted out each man's name and wrote down the aye or the no shouted back in response. The clerk tallied the results. Ayes 25, noes 4. The resolution is adopted by the Senate, but it must now be concurred in by the House. And the new question of the day is, how many votes does it take to pass? Lawyers, you might want to cover your ears at this point. You see, Tennessee Attorney General Frank Thompson opined that a majority of the members present could ratify or reject the proposed amendment, not a constitutional majority of 50, but a simple majority of those voting. In short, it would all come down to the ruling of the Speaker of the House, Seth Walker, and what he wanted to do. Lawyers, it's okay to listen now. On August 14, 1920, the Chattanooga News reported that Speaker Seth Walker would not vote in favor of ratification, despite President Woodrow Wilson personally asking for his support. Senate Joint Resolution 1 was doomed in the House and in Tennessee. But those favoring women's suffrage now had another option. The North Carolina legislature has now gone into session. Remember that North Carolina was one of those states that had not yet voted on it. They could ratify it, becoming the 36th state to do so, and the suffrage amendment would be made a part of the U.S. Constitution. The Memphis News-Senator, August 17, 1920. Amid scenes which the State House has never witnessed since the days of the Civil War, the North Carolina legislature began the consideration today of ratification of the federal woman suffrage amendment, and the amendment was rejected. The will of the people of our states must be the law. If this crime is perpetrated, let it not be laid at the door of either North Carolina or her daughter, Tennessee. There was now one state left that could ratify the proposed 19th Amendment before the presidential election of November 1920, and it came down to one vote in one house in that building. On Tuesday, August 17th, the House took up Senate Joint Resolution 1 and promptly adjourned for the day before voting on it. On Wednesday, August 18th, the Speaker of the House, Seth Walker, made the motion to table the resolution, to kill it without voting on it. The motion failed on a tie vote, 48-48. But for it to be adopted, it must have a majority. A tie on the vote on the resolution will cause it to fail. The clerk again shouts out each man's name and writes down the aye or the no shouted back in response. Thereupon, the resolution was concurred in and adopted by the following vote: ayes 50, noes 46. The House had ratified the 19th Amendment. But where did the votes come from? Representative Harry T. Byrne of McMinn County had changed his vote from I table it to I pass it. His was the 49th aye, giving the resolution a majority of those voting, 49-47. He then fled the House chamber, fearing for his life. To escape them all, he darted from committee room to committee room, climbed out a third-story window, and teetered along the coping on the outside wall until he made his way to a window opening into the state library. Mrs. John Trotwood Moore, state librarian, remembers his escaping up the library spiral staircase under the hot August roof, but he did not escape accusations of bribery and threats of exposure of various sinister deeds. The next day, the clerk of the House read a message from Representative Byrne, which was then printed in the House Journal. I want to take this opportunity to state that I changed my vote in favor of ratification because I believe in full suffrage as a right. I believe we had a moral and legal right to ratify. I know that a mother's advice is always safest for her boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification. I appreciated the fact that an opportunity such as seldom comes to mortal man to free 17 million women from political slavery was mine. I desired that my party, in both state and nation, might say that it was a Republican from the mountains of East Tennessee, the purest Anglo-Saxon section of the world, who made national women's suffrage possible at this date, not for any personal glory, but for the glory of his party. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. You see, the 50th aye came from Speaker Seth Walker, who changed his vote from no to aye. This was not because his heart grew 3 sizes that day when he heard the singing of all the who's down in Whoville, the tall and the small. Instead, because he changed his vote in favor to the prevailing side, he could then control what happened next to the resolution. and his motion was to reconsider their action in adopting the resolution. The Memphis News-Senator: "The next step in the suffrage fight will come tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock when Speaker Walker's motion to reconsider has the right of way." But time was now on the side of the suffragists. On Saturday, August 21st, the House convened, prepared to reconsider their ratification, and 59 members were present, 7 members short of a quorum. With no quorum, the House could conduct no business and could not reconsider their action. Day after day passed. The anti-suffragists turned to the courts, getting injunctions to stop the certification of the ratification. Finally, on the afternoon of August 31st, the House had a quorum, 91 members present. Speaker Seth Walker made the motion, or demanded the vote. Representative Hall made the motion, and the House non-concurred in Senate Joint Resolution 1 by the vote of 47 to 24. But it's what happened right before then that becomes important. A point of order was made that the House did not have Senate Joint Resolution 1 before them. It was not in the possession of the House, so they could not properly vote on it. So the question became, where was Senate Joint Resolution 1? Senator Lon McFarland moved that the Speaker of the Senate appoint a committee to go find that resolution. The committee was appointed, and the committee reported back. Mr. Speakers, we, your committee, beg to report that after an interview with the governor, that he stated to us that on advice of the Attorney General of the state, that he had certified to the authorities at Washington the action of both House and Senate on the 19th Amendment, and that he had embodied in his report a copy of both House and Senate journals as it actually occurred in the journal. It was over. No court, no legislature, no man could undo what had been done. The 19th Amendment was ratified, not by legend, not by Congress, but by one vote that happened in that building. Tennessee has had many nicknames over the years: the Volunteer State, the Big Bend State, even the Hog and Hominy State. But there was a time in August 1920 when it had only one nickname that mattered: the Perfect 36. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all of my time. Thank you for your time. 45 years ago, I sat in seat 19 here and cast the deciding vote for woman suffrage. My voting franchised every woman in the United States. Today, 45 years later, I am back here in a body of this nature. The only reason that I am here, of course, is that I was the youngest member of the House at that time. Harry T. Byrne. Journal and Proceedings of the Limited Constitutional Convention of 1965. The actual words spoken on the floor of that House. What happened to the political careers of the men involved? Governor A.H. Roberts, the governor of the state who called the extraordinary session, who brought the men together to vote on SJR 1, lost his re-election bid in November 1920 to Governor A.A. Taylor. Speaker Seth Walker, the man who did everything he could to stop the ratification, never ran for public office again. Harry T. Byrne won his re-election to his seat in November 1920. He was then elected to the Tennessee State Senate in 1948 and in 1950. He was also a delegate to the Tennessee Limited Constitutional Conventions of 1953, 1959, and 1965, and served as the vice president of the 1965 Constitutional Convention. That's a more than 45-year career in and out of politics. Isn't there a story about Harry T. Byrne reading a letter from his mother? Representative Byrne had received a letter from his mother, and supposedly he had it in his pocket at the time that he made his vote. There's no evidence that he ever read the letter on the floor of the House, but the letter did say, "Hurrah and vote for suffrage, and don't keep them in doubt. I noticed Chandler's speech. It was very bitter. I've been watching to see how you stood, but have not seen anything yet. Write Mother every time you get a chance, for I am always looking for a letter when you are away. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Thomas Cat with her rats. Is she the one that put rat in ratification? Ha! No more from Mama this time, with lots of love, Mama." She wanted the right to vote. She really wanted the right to vote and did not know how her son, the representative, was going to vote on that resolution. What happened to the breaking of the quorum? It was actually those opposed to suffrage who broke the quorum. They fled the state and went to Decatur, Alabama, to prevent the vote from happening on the reconsideration. They did not think they had enough votes to stop the reconsideration, so they simply fled the state and broke the quorum. They also wanted to prevent the speakers from signing the resolution. And there is no indication that SJR 1 was ever signed by either speaker. The anti-suffrage forces had gotten an injunction in the courts stopping the certification of the ratification. It could not be sent out of the state. Nothing could be done to it under court order. That injunction was then suspended by writ of order of the Tennessee Supreme Court Justice D.L. Langston. He simply declared there was no danger of any legal objection. And there were other lawsuits and attempts to prevent the certification of the ratification. It took the United States Supreme Court in 1922 to declare, "The proclamation by the Secretary certified that, from official documents on file in the Department of State, it appeared that the proposed amendment was ratified by the legislatures of 36 states, and that it had become valid to all intents and purposes as a part of the Constitution of the United States. As the legislatures of Tennessee and of West Virginia had the power to adopt the ratification, official notice to the Secretary of State duly authenticated that they had done so was conclusive upon him, and being certified by his proclamation is conclusive upon the courts." So why not more lawsuits to stop the ratification? When it looked like Tennessee would not ratify, the Connecticut legislature went into extraordinary session a month later. They ratified the amendment the next month, September 1920, becoming the 37th state to do so. So even if Tennessee's ratification was somehow overturned, there was still another state that had ratified that would be the 36th state. So 37 states ratified. Eventually, all the states ratified the 19th Amendment, even those that had earlier rejected the amendment. The most recent was Mississippi, who ratified the 19th Amendment in 1984. 2 states have still never ratified the 19th Amendment, Alaska and Hawaii. As those states joined the Union after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the amendment was never sent to either state, so neither state ever had the opportunity to ratify the amendment. Do we know how many women voted in 1920? We do not know how many women voted in 1920. In 1916, there were over 17 million votes cast for president. In 1920, that number was over 25 million votes. So about 8 million more votes between the two elections, but no way of knowing how many of those were women. That's still far short, though, of the 17 million women freed from political slavery by Representative Byrne. Which kind of begs the question, who's worse off? The person who cannot vote or the person who can and just doesn't?